The Internal Revenue Service is scrutinizing tax-exempt status from conservative groups with the names Tea Party or Patriots has impacted the Ottawa County Patriots. Is this a case of party politics? Were laws broken? We'll discuss on West Michigan Week. And thank you for joining us on West Michigan Week. On our panel, Dave Murray, MLive Media Group.
Thank you, Patrick.
And on the panel, Devin Schindler, Professor of Constitutional Law at Cooley Law School.
Great pleasure to be here.
And Jim Chioda, Ottawa County Patriots.
Thank you for having me, Patrick.
Well, this scandal seems to be ramping up day by day, but let's begin with the baseline, kind of the 30,000-foot overview of all of this. And I know, Devin, you've really been looking into this case, and you're the man with the law background. So let's begin with the basics.
Absolutely. Under our tax structure, you can essentially be one of three kinds of organizations. You can be your classic for-profit corporation where all the tax laws would apply to you. You have to pay taxes. Alternatively, you can be a charitable organization, also known as a 501c3 organization, the term you hear the media talking about. Charitable organizations have very limited ability to engage in electioneering or politicking activity. Essentially, to be a charitable organization, your focus has to be almost exclusively on education or community improvement, whatever the case may be. Between a for-profit and a charitable organization, we have another category known as a 501c4, social welfare organization. Now, the rules for social welfare organizations are a little different. Again, charitable organizations cannot engage in any politicking or electioneering activity. 501c4 activities, social welfare activities, their primary purpose has to be to improve the social welfare of the community or the area, whatever the case may be. They are allowed to engage in some electioneering and politicking activities so long as it's not their primary purpose. And so part of the debate that we're seeing played out over the last few weeks is what category do some of these Tea Party organizations properly belong in? Are they engaged primarily in politicking, which means they do not qualify for either a charitable organization or a social welfare organization, or in fact are they involved primarily in social welfare, which in case they would qualify for 501c4 status?
And Jim, you filed for 501c3.
Correct, because we viewed ourselves as an educational organization. And ironically, a great number of Tea Parties are not anything much more than a coffee clutch of a group of people who get together and share their thoughts. But we applied for a C3 after several years of self-funding. We reach into our own pockets to pay for expenses and so on and so forth. And it was our thought that we could attract donations to help fund our efforts if the donations to us were tax deductible. And that's what a C3 gives you. But our papers that we first filed did indeed education awareness on issues.
And this goes back to 2011, right, when you first filed?
Correct. August of 2011, we first filled out the paperwork. And we had a group out of Florida that does this sort of, they're not like a legal firm, but they focus on helping you complete paperwork. And naturally, they collected a fee from us. And they helped us fill out everything. They reviewed it, and they said, you know what, if you're rejected, we'll refund your fee. So we felt fairly confident going ahead and submitting our application to the IRS in August of 2011. And of course, there's another fee that's associated with that. And then we sat back and waited, and waited, and waited. And at the advice of the organization that helped us, we resubmitted. And this time we submitted using return receipt, registered mail type of thing. And we did get a response, and it was signed by Lois Lerner, and it said to the effect that your application, yada, 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 you may be approved immediately, you may take a little while, or we may need more review, and you will hear from us in 90 days.
Lois Lerner is, of course, the IRS leader who was testifying before Congress this past week and took the Fifth Amendment on a couple of tough questions about this activity.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
She's the director of exempt organizations, and her responsibility ultimately is to determine which organizations qualify under these various categories. Again, if the distinction between a C3 and C4 is purely educational versus educational plus lobbying and politicking. The IRS has a very difficult job distinguishing between organizations that are truly fully educational or organizations that are seeking tax-exempt status, essentially don't deserve it. And that's the real issue that her and her staff has to confront.
Seemed to have trouble remembering a lot of things this week when she was testifying about it.
Well, but that aside, I mean, there's more to the story, because you keep getting more letters, right? I mean, this gets dragged out. You still don't know.
We've gotten several letters, and the interesting thing is that I've had some pushback. You know, there's online forums such as MLive. There's in Holland. There's the Sentinel, and then of course there's Facebook, where I have a great number of people some who love me and some who don't, and it's not a question of whether we were wronged or whether we were discriminated against. It becomes a question, well, you didn't deserve it because you're this, because you're that. It's important to note that our organization has existed, be it as a coffee clutch or to an organized group, which happened in July of 2011. We actually incorporated with the state of Michigan. Previous to that, we were nothing. I can't imagine, coffee clutch is the best word I can use. And that we did have a website, and that, there's probably some fine line of information between what is politicking and what is not. And on Facebook, which everybody says all kinds of stuff, there could be perceptions. There could be perceptions of what Jim Chiodo, private citizen, says, and Jim Chiodo, president of the Ottawa County Patriots, says. And they are indeed two different things. I am a citizen. I have every right to support Patrick for President of the United States, or Dave, or whatever, okay?
It'd be a big mistake.
But to obtain tax-exempt status, however, and avoid taxes, your organization or any of these organizations have to be fully involved and invested only in education. Put yourself into the perspective of the IRS just for a moment. How do you make this distinction? Let me give you an example. Mr. Chiodo gave an interview last year, and he was asked, what is the goal of your organization? And he stated, and I quote, "The goal is to affect policy and influence the election of officials who will defend and protect the original meaning of the Declaration of Independence." Now, in his defense, he also said in the same interview, well, it's an education process whereby Tea Party members educate themselves on issues and problems facing our country. If I'm the IRS, I have two statements that are categorically different here. Clearly, the first statement does not add up to 501c3, because clearly the first statement talking about influence election officials is politicking. C3 organizations can't do that. Maybe it qualifies as a C4. I don't want to give legal advice here because there's a mixed motive, but the IRS has to then make a determination, has to seek further documentation, further input to make sure people aren't ducking their taxes through sort of false classification. So, granted, a lot of these organizations are purely educational and some do politic. But what a difficult situation the IRS finds itself in.
Well, the question would be not necessarily did Mr. Chiodo's group get the approval, but are there left-leaning groups who are very similar, who have approval, and are there right-leaning groups who are not getting the approval?
Well,
that seems to be the crux of the problem.
Well, the crux of the problem, and I go one step further.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not here to defend the IRS.
Right.
Clearly, in May of 2010, they created a list, be on the lookout, a BOLO list, they called it. They said, look, over the last 3 years, the number of 501c4 applications that we've received have tripled. We're overwhelmed. Essentially, they had, at that point, one person looking through all of these.
Wow.
With 3 times as many, over 3,000. And so the IRS had to do a cognitive shortcut. They said, look, we have to find a better way to determine which ones we're to take to secondary review or deeper review. So they created the BOLO list, and essentially they said, well, we need to look out particularly for a lot of these new Tea Party outfits, and they use the word Tea Party and all of that, because a lot of them, candidly, are involved in electioneering. Not necessarily Mr. Chiodo's group, but a lot of them are. Tea Party appeared on the ballot, a different group. So they used this list to say, okay, these are organizations that we have suspicions about that may be involved in politicking and therefore are misusing 501c4. Now, they should have done it. Clearly, you shouldn't use a list. But the fact of the matter is, out of the different organizations that were pulled for secondary review, according to the Inspector General's report, about 1/3 of them had the word Tea Party or Patriot or whatever else was on the list. Curiously, When upper management discovered what was going on 2 occasions, they told the lower level reviewers, stop using the list. It's not the right thing to do. Now, granted, they should have done it in the first place, but it was a shortcut that the IRS was using. Should have done it, but a shortcut the IRS was using to go through what was essentially a mountain of paper to determine who was properly applying and who was misusing the tax-exempt status laws.
But what about any kind of investigation? What about any kind of review? It never happened in our case.
Well, that's not entirely true. In your case, it may or may not. You have the way the system works is you have an initial review. We take a look at purpose, we look at your activities, things like that. Based on the initial review, it will go to a secondary review where sometimes they'll ask for more documentation. There's also a tertiary review. I can't speak to your particular case, but approximately, well not approximately, 296 of these organizations that use Tea Party and had sort of the mix, these were 501c4, and sort of the mixed purposes, were set aside for further review.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about how the Citizens United case is impacting the current IRS scandal in just 1 minute. And we're back with more West Michigan Week, and we're discussing the IRS scandal. And I know, Devin, you have been, you've talked about the Citizens United case, and in essence, you agree with the ruling of the Supreme Court, and yet this is somewhat of a fallout from that ruling and what is taking place with this case.
Yeah, there's always the law of unintended consequences. Once the Supreme Court ruled that corporations have the right to free speech, actually they ruled that back in the 40s, but setting that point aside, once the corporation made the determination that legal entities had free speech rights, you have this interface with tax law that for-profit corporations should continue to pay taxes. However, charitable organizations should not have to pay taxes. Well, naturally, the incentive of any organization is to lobby, to politic for whatever their purposes are. But we've made a policy decision at the IRS level that, and rightfully so, I think, that, look, if you're a religious organization and, you know, the Boy Scouts and you're not really in the world of politics, your donations should be tax exempt. We need to treat that differently from organizations that have these mixed motives, these mixed methods. And I do think that the rise of the number of organizations, the trebling, essentially, over a 3-year period, the number of organizations seeking this 501c4 status ties directly not only to the rise of the Tea Party, but also to the Citizens United case, where a number of organizations said, hey, we are now allowed to officially engage in politicking so long as it's not our primary purpose, our primary function, and obtain some tax relief, well, we should apply for this. So I do think there's very much a connection between the rise in the number of organizations seeking this status and the Citizens United case.
So if the case had come down, say, 6, 7 years earlier, when there was a lot of opposition to President Bush's policies and groups springing up, that might have been the same type of groundswell.
I think without a doubt.
The other way,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think there's without a doubt. As soon as Citizens United came along, you can get the best of both worlds. I can speak and get tax-free status. Why not apply for it? A lot of groups, which Trudeau's right, a lot of groups don't bother to do it. But you do get the big advantage, not the donations necessarily at C4 level, but you know, the expenses and all of that. You essentially get to run as a nonprofit. There's a huge benefit tax-wise. It's particularly to be a C3. Then you're golden.
One of the things between a statement, and you are correct, I did make that statement, is that do you measure a group by their actions or by a comment, okay? And as we filled out our paperwork, this is our purpose. This is what our meetings are about, and they are indeed about education and awareness. And they're on issues, just like the League of Women Voters takes an advocacy on different issues, we do the same. And the great number of meetings that we have, whether it be on climate change, whether it be on voter ID, whether it be on touchy discussions like race, we bring, or we at least invite, people with opposite opinions to come and speak. So measure me on my actions.
Well, how do you educate?
Well, I mean, I can defend Jim. I receive many of the news releases, and there is that element of education.
I would say it's an element not just of education, but of awareness. again, there are issues. There are issues like gun control. There are issues like immigration. There's issues like climate, climate and taxes and the size of government and what have you.
Well, could I, as a newspaper, then claim that my role is to educate the public on all kinds of issues and things? I mean, how, I can make that
But
claim.
potentially, yes, but then you'd have to operate as a nonprofit,
Oh,
and your shareholders
right.
couldn't gather any of the benefits.
We're
But-
stopping that rule right here.
We do that here.
That's right.
Public broadcasting does.
So, yes, it's, one of the things that a corporation, the Koch brothers or George Soros or Media Matters, they have a team of spokespeople to cross every T and dot every I. They have corporate communications. Nothing is said. When you look at the Tea Party groups, myself included, I'm not a big wheel. I'm not Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, although, well, no, I won't go there. I don't have that kind of resources. I don't have that kind of organizational structure, and certainly no team of lawyers or accountants behind me. And yeah, in a statement like that, perhaps that is a mistake, sort of like when we heard that it was a mistake to target patriot groups. Well, a mistake is when you're typing a letter or a word and you substitute like an A for an I. But the word progressive and the word patriots, it'd be pretty hard to make a typo to have one versus the other.
Let me say this, Mr. Cheeto, my purpose of that quote was not necessarily to call
Oh, I
your group
understand.
out,
I'm not.
But we need to look at this again from the perspective, as much as it pains me, the perspective of the IRS. Mr. Cheeto here seems like, I just met him, but he seems like a very forthright, honest fellow. I'm the IRS. I have 3,000 Mr. Cheetos sitting in my office, essentially on paper, all claiming this beneficent purpose, either social welfare or purely charitable. My job is to make sure people don't cheat on their taxes, and it happens. Organizations set themselves up as charitable organizations that aren't. Imagine the outcry if they didn't do a review. The next thing you know, we have all these 501c4 showing up on ballots and all of this sort of thing. Now, let's put this at the level that the IRS has to look at it. Their job is to root through all these applications and find out who's legitimately engaged in education functions and who is not. Now, again, I'm not defending the use of the list,
Right.
but ultimately, at some point, you have to say, this is their job. They could have done it better. They need more resources to do it better. But based on the Inspector General report, which came out last week, it's about 54 pages long, there really isn't any implication in that report, near as I can tell, or any of the evidence I've seen, of some grand President Obama conspiracy. And I
Well,
say this as-
but the problem could be that this came out in June or May of 12, and we're hearing about it in May of 13.
Well, two things.
And passing the whole election cycle, when perhaps this might have been a pretty neat topic for discussion much of last year.
Well, whether it would make any difference in the election, we can only speculate.
Oh, yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, the first investigatory report by the IRS itself came out in 12. According to the Inspector General report, that didn't come to the attention, well, the President just recently, but the Department of Treasury, again, we're talking about mid-level bureaucrats here, folks. We're not talking about President Obama. It came to their attention, too. Should they have spoken? Yeah, perhaps. Should they have contacted Congress? Perhaps. But to the extent people are claiming, in my mind at least, that the White House was involved in this grand conspiracy to go after the Tea Party and essentially Republican or conservative groups, the Inspector General report in no way, shape, or form supports or any of the evidence, in my mind, other than I suppose there was some indication that some IRS people stopped by the President's house, the White House, shortly about this time, which happens all the time, incidentally. There's really no evidence that I've seen, hard evidence, of any grand conspiracy. And if you read the report, you can see, and have worked in any bureaucracy, which I have historically, you can see exactly what happened. You had an overwhelmed group, really one fellow going, what do I do with these 3,000 applications? Shouldn't have done what they did, but I do not see evidence of a grand conspiracy.
Well,
I do have a theory on this, okay? I'm the coach of a football team, and at halftime I call in the players, and I tell them to win one for the Kipper, do whatever it takes, and so on. The team, and let's say this team now is the administration staff in every agency across the board. This team is going to do whatever it takes, and if it takes me as a right tackle going after his injury on his Achilles tendon, then that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do whatever it takes. Now, when you couple that with the fact that all of these employees of the IRS are union members that have been vocally anti-Tea Party, that's also their team. So you have this team, and what that team is hearing is the coach. Every time he gets behind a microphone, every time he's on TV, the enemy is the Tea Party. The enemy is Rush Limbaugh. The enemy is Fox News. And in fact, we saw further evidence of us being the enemy last week. There was a national day of protest against the IRS, and our group was over here on East Paris near the IRS building, and we were out there waving our flags and so on and so forth. And wouldn't you know, the enforcement/intimidation arm of the government happened to drive by, Homeland Security, and it has done that at a number of IRS protests last Tuesday in force. You know, why? What is this intimidation? You know, here we have little old ladies and not so little old men out there exercising our rights, and we are the enemy. Meanwhile, the real enemy, such as what we saw in Boston, gets a bye.
They shot them. I don't know about that. I don't know if they got a buy.
Leading up to the actual violence.
But I don't know if it passed through from a Homeland Security car is a lot of intimidation. I mean, I could see if there's protesters in front of a government building, the enforcement wing is going to take a peek at it. I mean, and maybe when they took a peek at it, they saw it was little old ladies and they kept going. But I think there might be some negligence that they said, oh, it's just Tea Party guys. We're not going to check that out.
Let's not forget that I'm not equating the radical right, the Tea Party, in any way, shape, or form, but let's not forget that same milieu has led to people like Timothy McVeigh. I'm not equating the two. Most Tea Party people I know are very solid Americans, the vast, vast majority. But every organization that's on either fringe will have a small number of folks that are going to be radicalized. Again, not equating the Tea Party with the true violent radicals, but
you did.
They did try. They did try to equate every incidence of violence, every incidence, whether it be a school shooter, whether it be some crazy that blows up a bomb somewhere, such as what happened in Boston. They tried to pin it on the Tea Party. They were hoping that it turned out to be a white American. Okay, when I say they, I'm talking about the media now, which
Well, they couldn't
really
say who it was because they didn't know.
Exactly, but there's always this speculation. For instance, shooting Gabby Gifford. Oh, that's Sarah Palin targeting, okay? And, you know, Timothy McVeigh, he's more like Bill Ayers or the the Occupy Wall Street group. I have yet, and I have been involved in Tea Party gatherings, rallies, meetings for 4.5 years. I have yet to meet one radical.
Well,
if they exist.
No, wait. First of all, I didn't.
Okay.
Second of all, again, we're getting off topic here a bit, but the Department of Homeland Security is tasked with a huge responsibility, and frankly, that's a discussion for another day. But if I'm the Department of Homeland Security, who am I going to look at? I'm going to look at groups, fringe groups, and there are many members, you just said it, of the Tea Party that sort of mainstream America would call fringe. I'm not justifying it at all,
Right.
but there is, it's a different situation.
Looking forward, because we're not going to sell this one anytime
Absolutely,
soon.
we'd have to get into fisticuffs, but go on.
So looking forward, how does the IRS go about this in the future with these political groups that are springing up if the amount is huge? And how do they avoid getting into the, whatever administration is in charge at the time, being accused of targeting folks?
Great question. That, I think, is the real fear that I have, that this particular brouhaha, and I don't want to minimize it, they shouldn't have used the criteria, but this particular brouhaha is going to take focus off what the real issue here. And the real issue here is, one, we need tax reform. We need comprehensive tax reform. We need statutes and regulations written in a fashion that the bureaucrats of the world can adopt them and can apply them, and that the taxpayer can understand how the tax process works. We're going to spend the next 3 or 4 months debating this, and it's an issue. I'm not suggesting otherwise. Instead of, in my mind, focused on the real issue here, which is, one, the IRS doesn't have the resources it needs. You have really just a handful of people trying to go through 3,500 applications. 2, we have a tax code which makes very little sense. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law for 30 years. I get lost in the tax code within a minute. How's the average American on the street supposed to understand it? That's the big issue here. We need tax reform. We need to give the IRS the resources it needs so it doesn't have to take these cognitive shortcuts that lead to troubles.
Jim, you got about 10 seconds here.
Didn't the IRS just hire 16,000 more people to enforce Obamacare? And my solution to the IRS is the same as Ted Cruz: eliminate it. Flat tax, simple. You don't need these hordes of people doing all this stuff, with the potential for the team and the team players taking the coaches' get 'em attitude and turning it into something unethical.
All right. Well, we'll keep watching this as it evolves. Dave Murray, MLive Media Group,
Thank you,
thanks for
Patrick.
stopping by. Devin Schindler, Professor of Constitutional Law, Cooley Law School, and Jim Chiodo, Ottawa County Patriots. Thank all of you for being here. Great conversation.
Great.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next week on West Michigan Week.